Well, people are still arriving, Dr. Luvall, but I would like to introduce us because I actually haven't met you personally, but I was at one of your presentations earlier this spring, and I thought it was a fabulous presentation. And I knew that this group of NASA interns would really be interested in everything you have to say. So Cassie and I, my name is Rusty Lowe, and I'm working with Cassie Sofing, and we are leading the Globe Mosquito Habitat Mapper app. And
okay.
And Cassie runs the campaign. I'm the lead scientist that developed the app and is leading the science part of this program. And I'd like to introduce you to this incredible cohort of NASA STEM enhancement in the Earth Sciences group. They are all rising juniors and seniors in high school and are part of this very, what I want to say, it's an extremely competitive internship program. And the work that we're doing this summer is we are using citizen science observations of land cover and of mosquito habitats in order to develop a data set that we can then use satellite data with. And so by looking at things at sort of high granularity on the ground, we're hoping that we'll be able to make some contribution to some of the stuff that you actually have been really interested in with regard to microclimate and things like that. So what we're doing is we're starting on the ground, and then we are comparing our ground observations to high resolution satellite imagery from Maxar, and then hopefully able to then upscale that to begin to understand what we're seeing based on other kinds of environmental parameters that we can get from space. So I hope you enjoy talking to these folks. I think they'll have some wonderful questions for you. And let's just get started in about 2 minutes.
Okay, great.
Great. Do you have any questions about us, Dr. Luvall, before we get started?
Yeah, if you could you explain a little bit about your STEM program? This is the part of the Texas.
Yes, that's right.
Right?
So the SEAS program is run by Margaret Baggio, as I'm sure you're probably aware. One of the things that we did during the pandemic is all the teams went virtual. And we were one of the teams that were virtual last summer. And teams, again, are virtual this summer. And so we have a large cohort here that is working with collecting their own data using the Globe Observer, the NASA Globe Observer Citizen Science Platform. And then we are going to be accessing NASA data and coming to some resolution about how that data can be used. And I'm very vague about that because each team is going to have their own project. Then the projects can be based on some of these talks that they've heard about what might be of interest to them. So we have a lot of people here that do coding. We last week, well, I guess a little bit earlier this week, we had someone talking about AI. And last year we had some students that did some work with machine learning. So there's just a wide variety of things that people do. Another project that people did last summer is they calculated NDVI based on the measurements that were obtained on the ground and then compared that to satellite data in space. So there's just a whole lot of different things that people get interested in. And they have a month to do that research after they spend a month sort of learning the basic science. So that's our way of doing things.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I know I mentioned in my email that I was one of the initial founders of Globe. The scientist, our chief scientist at Marshall was a chief scientist at Globe. And so I worked with Dixon Butler and everybody and put together the first protocols here at Marshall for the Globe program. So it's really interesting to see how that program has grown from the early years, and it's been a very good program for everybody and has expanded globally, and I think it's been great.
I think it's been great too. And I think I just probably missed interacting with you because I started working with the GLOBE program when I was running an outreach program for the University of Minnesota, all the science
Okay.
colleges. And so I got involved with GLOBE in year 2000. So about 5 years, I
Oh,
guess.
okay. Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm an
Yeah, we
early
did the
bird, but not
first.
as early as you.
Yeah, we did the first Teach the Teachers workshop and did all that stuff at Purdue, and brought in multi-spec and everything else like that.
Right.
You
And I
know,
have to say, here I am
yeah.
today, and my first experience with remote sensing in NASA was multi-spec. So there you go.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
really, really
It's
cool.
amazing. Yeah. Well, so
Great. Well,
yeah,
I think
and pardon, I go get started if you want. I'll keep this, fairly informal. Please feel free to interrupt for questions. Um, so, uh, welcome opportunity to talk to the students because they're our future, and we're entering the golden age of remote sensing. And I'm going to go into the reasons why in my talk. But the students that I'm talking to now will be the ones that will be actually using this data when it starts to become available in the, say, roughly 2027 timeframe,
yep.
and on. So I'll I guess I can share my screen for my presentation. That'll work. So let me get started. But I'm going to keep this informal, and the slides. This is a scientific presentation, so these are the slides I give at conferences and reviews and things like that. And I understand that it's going to be new for everybody. I'm challenging you, and what I'm showing you, to understand it. And I know you can because I'm also the science mentor for the NASA Develop program at Marshall. I've worked in that for almost the whole time it's been. And so at one time we did have high school students in that program. And so I've seen what students can do when they are challenged, and they live up to the challenge. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and I'll give you a little background while I'm talking, just so you get a feel, because I've been with NASA over 36 years. And when I first started back in 85, the precursor, essentially Landsat, started in 72, 74. And, it was a very limited system. And basically that's all we had, except some of the meteorological satellites, about roughly the same time frame. And you used to have to actually buy the data. So I remember at one time a scene of Landsat cost $4,000. So that greatly limited people's access to the data, and the computers required to process that data required a whole building. And so, it's really changed. It's just dramatically changed since that time. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. And, am I limited to an hour? Does it matter? I mean, I've got plenty of time. I'm not sure how you're scheduling
So
this.
we've scheduled this for an hour, but I would be happy
Okay.
if we run a little bit over. That's great. I think it's really important
Okay.
to have people have a chance to ask questions. So thanks very much for the generosity of your time, Dr. Luvall.
Oh, sure. It's my pleasure. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and see if this screen share. Okay. So today's presentation, I'm going to give a little history. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit about remote sensing. I'm going to talk about some of the instruments. I'm going to talk about some of the theory behind what we're observing and why it's important, particularly in your case, for observing mosquito habitats, life cycles, and how it's important in transmission of disease. And mosquitoes are the major vector of many, many, many diseases. Everything from viral diseases like dengue to parasites like malaria. So, obviously, the more we understand about the mosquitoes and their habitat and their population dynamics and how all that relates to the environment, the better handle we have on determining risk and preventing these diseases from occurring. So NASA actually has one of their application programs is public health, which really surprises people. But NASA's been in the public health field for a long time. And so if we look at, obviously NASA studies a lot, and a lot of people just think of NASA, space station and the moon and all that stuff, but actually our program for Earth observations is over $2 billion a year. So we're the largest federal agency, US-wide and in the world, to actually look at climate variability and the Earth's surface. So a huge impact and investment. So the NASA Applied Sciences program is directed to taking all the data from these satellites and using it for societal benefit. So, it's everything from looking at public health to maybe agriculture to fisheries to whatever. And if you look at this is an actual strategic statement for public health, earth science applications for public health safety, infectious disease, response, preparedness, et cetera, environmental health issues. So NASA has a very strong program in that. So I always like to give a context of where we've been to where we are now, and that I think gives you a better understanding of maybe where we want to go from here. So as humans, we've always been interested in observing our environment. And it didn't take long after the balloon was invented for people to start taking photos. So the earliest that I know of and recorded use of, quote, remote sensing was a French person who went up in a balloon and took a picture of Paris. And now I've got one of Massachusetts. So that's a long time for people using remote sensing. And so another thing I like to add, do you guys know how to use remote sensing at all? That's just see head shaking. Fortunately, we're virtual. I prefer doing this in the classroom. Okay, so you don't know how to use remote sensing, huh? Never use it. Okay, well, what do you do with your eyes? What do you do with your ears? It's no different. Your eyes are receiving light from the various objects around you, and your brain is processing it. And that's basically what remote sensing is. But even with all the technology, your brain is a much better processor of the image data received from your eyes, much quicker and much more detail. So if we look at the Earth science missions that NASA is either planning or currently has orbiting and observing the Earth system, there's a lot up there and a lot being planned. And I'll talk about our very recent development later in the talk, but there's a lot out there. So we're getting a lot of data from the Earth in all kinds of, say, wavelengths, light, microwave, all kinds of wavelengths, even gravity. So I always like to show this if people, when they look at an image generated by a satellite, how's that image generated. And this happens to be Landsat. So, you know, these satellites give us the ability to observe the whole globe. And how is that done? Well, I just kind of liken it to peeling an orange on the orbiting satellites. And this kind of gives you an illustration. So you're pointing down to Earth's surface with a sensor, and the Earth is rotating under you, and the satellite obviously is moving to stay in orbit, and it has a certain path width. And over time, the whole surface of the Earth is covered. And depending on a lot of factors, Landsat, for example, it takes 16 days to go over the same place on the Earth's surface. If the satellite's in geostationary orbit, it's out at 22,000 miles, and we're getting images every 3 minutes for the whole, we call the full disk, and that's the face that's facing the satellite. So as you can see, over time, the whole Earth is eventually covered. Okay, so that determines, how frequently you can get an observation at whatever you're interested in. And the other concept that's important is resolution, spatial resolution. So, MODIS, each one of those little pixels is 1 kilometer in size, and you can see you don't get very much detail. On Landsat, this happens to be the thermal channel of 7, it's 60-meter resolution. So here on the MODIS, you really can't tell what you're looking at. But on Landsat, you can see the center pivot irrigation fields. So it's always a trade-off when we're designing a satellite system. Do you want frequent temporal, looking at the surface a lot, or do you want high spatial resolution? It's always a trade-off. You're not going to get both. Okay, so we started working with CDC many years ago, over 20 years ago, Center for Disease Control. We thought that NASA and remote sensing had a lot to offer the public health community. So if you study epidemiology, or it's the study of disease and how it interacts with the populations and so on. The John Snow study is the classic, the start of epidemiology. And that was where in London, they were getting cholera deaths. Now, cholera is a waterborne disease due to poor sanitation. He developed methodology for determining which well was actually infecting the population. So they thought, that's a good example. What happens if we took John Snow's data and applied modern geospatial, statistics or GIS to it? Could we get the same, the same information? Could we predict the wells? So we did that, and sure enough, you look at the count, the deaths, and you find out that it's the same information. So that's interesting that back in 1854, the methodology that John Snow designed is still relevant and is useful for when we use high technology, image processing or GIS to look at the surface. And I had to go to London and look at the Broad Street pump that was there, and that was the major center for all the cholera transmission. So another reason that remote sensing is very important in studying disease vectors and habitats is that we alter our environment. So this is an aerial photograph of my study area in Costa Rica. It's called La Salva. And it's very obvious that the land has been altered. This is the natural tropical rainforest. And this forest used to be on the other side of the river. It is in patches, but those areas have been cleared for pasture and agriculture uses. Well, that has some real implications in the diseases and the hosts or vectors that carry those diseases. And this is the best illustration I can find. Chagas disease is carried by this beetle here, and they call it the kissing bug. And the habitat of this beetle is, a forest, tropical forest. So, but what happened is when went in and cleared those forests and replaced with the houses, well, those houses were great habitats for this insect. And when we destroy their habitat and their, they used to feed on native wildlife species, boy, cows and, farm animals are great, and also humans. So it's a very major problem in tropical America, and also it's been moving in the U.S. and along the border areas that they've been having problems with this. So anytime we go in and alter our environment, our landscape, we just don't know what the consequences will be. So this illustration was put together by my postdoc several years ago. I think it does a real good job of summarizing the importance of the environment to a vector. Mosquito, it really doesn't matter. So, you've got, your host, okay, and that could be, a human even, or an animal, could be an amphibian, bird, whatever, doesn't matter. And you got some kind of vector. Mosquitoes are great. And some kind of pathogen. And then you've got the environment and climate and weather. So all these factors impact all these other two legs of the triangle in what the risk is in transmitting that disease. So if one of these legs, so to speak, is not suitable, then you may not get the transmission of that particular disease. So we take that onto a landscape scale. This is the Bahia state in Brazil, and this just happens to be hookworms. So when you start looking at the environment, this happens to be just temperature and seasonality, precipitation. You can easily identify the areas that have a high risk of hookworms. So this is a modeling type thing. This is without remote sensing data. If you go into a mosquito-based disease like dengue, this comes from one of my students' project dissertation from Sri Lanka, Colombo in Sri Lanka. We were looking at the dengue risk models where we combine both the environmental factors, precipitation, temperature, onset of rainy season, that monsoon, that type of thing, with the actual structure of the city observed by remote sensing. And we could see that there are areas that were some years more predominantly that had a higher risk, then there's a obviously difference in years. There's differences the time of year, and there's differences in what part of the city was at the most risk. And if you look at what was important, at least as far as the structure or the urban fabric of that city, that increased risk factor, it was actually the wealthier areas of Colombo, because they had a lot of green space, they had pots and all that standing water. Well, that's the ideal habitat for an urban mosquito to breed in. And you could find those areas easily using remote sensing, looking at the greenness or other factors within that area. So the traditional model that was first developed in 1915, the Ross model, is formed the basis for all the models for malaria transmission and other diseases. It's very simple. So, if you look at, it's very set. The initial one was susceptible and infected, and so these are all very complicated equations they put into it to look at population dynamics and age and size and all kinds of things that are involved in this. And the more modernized version involves susceptible, exposure, okay, or exposed, infected, and recovered. So this is the mathematical models that epidemiologists use very simply to look at the risk of, in this case, malaria transmission, but it's just, virtually the same for many of the other vector-borne diseases to use. So if we get back to mosquitoes, one of the key measures they use for risk is what they call the vectorial capacity. So that just means, what is the potential? What is that mosquito population's capacity to infect humans? And so, there's a lot of things, how dense is the mosquito population? If you don't have many mosquitoes, the risk is a lot lower. How often does the population come in contact with the mosquitoes? There'd be a lot of mosquitoes, but if you stay away from them, they're not going to bite you. And, how many of the mosquitoes are actually infected? They're not all infected with that particular disease. And then, how long does a mosquito live? And this EIP time, how long does it take for a virus to be transmitted? Or it could be any other pathogen for malaria by the mosquitoes. So if a mosquito bites infected individual or animal or whatever and gets a blood meal and intakes that pathogen, it may go and bite another host, but it may not infect it because there's not enough virus or whatever in the mosquito. So once that pathogen gets in the gut of the mosquito, we call it amplification. And so it takes a certain number of days for that virus load to build up, or pathogen in case of malaria, before it's able to actually transmit that when it bites the next victim, so to speak, because it's in the gut and has to go in the salivary glands. There's a lot happening. Okay, so this is another way that they determine the risk factor. So this is some work from Becky, one of the people on our team, we're working in Colombia and Brazil on this. So we really want to know what causes the increase in risk of transmission. So that intrinsic incubation period, so that changes. And one of the primary reasons is that changes is what's happening in that environment the mosquito is living in. And there's two primary drivers. One is precipitation, and the second is temperature. So if we look at what happens, we can have, starting at 3 days and 7 days when it starts to be infectious, and you change the temperature. I didn't put the temperatures. This is only a difference of about 3 degrees Celsius. There was a doubling of the time that mosquito could transmit that disease. So temperature has a huge impact on the risk of transmission of many of these diseases in mosquitoes and other vectors. So now, how does all this relate to remote sensing? Well, I like to call this image a Gordian knot. And if you're familiar with some of the mythology, that's the knot that couldn't be untied, but the way they quote untied it is they just cut it. So this is an actual flight of an aircraft for one of my projects. I had the aircraft fly. That's actually a knot they flew when I was doing some precision agriculture work, but they tired of flying back and forth. This is over an agricultural land. But anyway, so to understand from a theoretical basis, we developed what we call a thermodynamics of ecosystem development. And that helps us identify factors in both in the development of ecosystems and also habitats and how it's suitable or non-suitable, or how it impacts mosquito populations and disease vector. Okay, so to kind of summarize, what can we get from satellites that's important to disease vectors? Well, water, precipitation, soil moisture, temperature, vapor pressure, i.e. relative humidity, wet, dry, where it's wet, where it's dry, how much exposure. But also, like I was talking about earlier, we can use monitor land use, land change, cover mapping. If we want to map ecological functions and structures, what ages of forest and mixtures of forest and pasture or whatever. Canopy cover, we can actually get species. We can phenology, or when the stage of that plant, when it flowers, so on. Aquatic plant coverage, really important for schistosomiasis in Lake Victoria, because that provides a habitat for snails, which are the host for the schistosomiasis. And the fishermen have to go into the water with their boats, walk out with their boats to go fishing, and they have to go through the aquatic plants on shore, and then the schistosomiasis is right there. But it provides a spatial context to that environment. And so with the spatial coverage, you get topography. So it's local, regional, and even global. And also, one of the greatest strengths is it provides a time series of measurements. So, a single measurement taken from anything may not tell you much. But if you do a time series, it helps you assess that change, what's happening. Okay. So the concept that I've developed is what I call just an ecological thermodynamic paradigm. And so what I attempt to do is take the epidemiological equations and see that they're adapted to incorporate all these environmental factors and interfaces. Because with remote sensing, you can measure, evaluate these environment factors and interface. And so you got the best of both worlds. You've got everything that the epidemiologist works with and understands, and also needs an understanding of that particular disease vector, the vector. You know, what's habitat, what's its life cycle, what determines the length of it, this sort of thing, and all that is put together to help us the risk. And so, you know, if we look just satellite data, just kind of summarize, you know, we can repeat the data. Spatial resolution may not be quick enough. Spatial resolution may be too coarse. That's a problem. You know, what kind of bands or light channels, how are we dividing up the light spectrum? Clouds are always a problem. Life cycle, it costs a lot to keep a satellite up and everything. Data availability, you know, that's all the challenges, satellite data. And if we look at the public health sides, availability of data, sampling issues, difficulty access to sampling areas, but also understanding what remote sensing can give, and you know, understanding all those relationships. And I'm going to go through this real quick, but to be able to compare apples to apples, so to speak, when you're looking at the Earth's surface, you're looking at ecosystems, urban areas, agriculture areas, don't matter. You know, you got to have a common denominator, and what I call the surface energy budget. And simply, that's all the sun's energy coming into the Earth's surface, and some of it's reflected back. And then how that energy is partitioned is a good common denominator to study the Earth's surface. And what's really important for vectors and mosquitoes is the surface energy budget, because the water, once it reaches the land surface, either goes in the soils and is evaporated, transpired to trees and grass and all that stuff. And all that drives that microclimate that the mosquito is exposed to. And all this can be measured by remote sensing. So I'll go through that just real quick here. So the surface temperature is actually dependent on how much sun it gets, and if it's grass or trees, and if it's losing water transpiration, it keeps the air cooler. If it's not, it's going to warm up. So that drives that environment. And you know, if the old way of understanding that, the water balance, to do the modeling, it requires a lot of complex measurements and information you probably don't have. But if you just measure surface temperature remotely, which we can, it provides the information that's needed without all these additional measurements. So what's it look like? So this is one of my projects several years ago. This is from an aircraft-based sensor, which measures visible light, just like Landsat, and also has thermal bands. And and this is Puerto Rico. This is the city of San Juan. And so if you're flying over San Juan and look out your aircraft window, this is what your eye would see. You see the city area, the blue of the ocean. These are coral areas. See the clouds and stuff. But that doesn't really tell you a lot about thermally the environment. This is what it looks like and when it's surface temperature. And you can see the clouds. And this is El Yunque rainforest, much cooler. So you can see these urban areas are much warmer. And when we clear an area and urbanize an area, we change that surface energy budget again to much different than what it was if it was a forest or a grassland or whatever. And the materials that are used in our urban environment get much hotter and hold the energy from the sun. And that affects the climate of that city. It's called the urban heat island effect. So typically urban areas, the nighttime temperatures can be 5 to 8 degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside. So think of what I just said, 5 to 8 degrees warmer. So what did I talk about earlier? How temperature impacts the life cycle of mosquitoes. So if you look at the major cities in the tropics, in Africa and everything, and you look at where they're located, for the most part, except for the coastal areas, of course, ports, you'll find those cities at 1,000 to 2,000 meters. And the reason they're allowed to develop, they were out of the malaria belt because it was cool enough. Well, you urbanize an area and you increase those temperatures, you're providing a much better habitat that's conducive for those mosquitoes that transmit whatever disease. And, if we look at what's happening on a very fine scale, this is just a thermal camera I took one of the first ones many years ago, just a parking lot in Athens, Georgia. You can see the impact of a tree shading the hot asphalt. So, there's a lot of complex environments within an urban area that can impact the life cycles of mosquitoes. And what I like to do is I like to call this the fingerprint of the urban fabric, where you look at the temperature and how reflective the surface. And these are diagnostic. And so you can identify specific areas within the city that are warmer than others and why they are. So you can go back and say, oh, that's a park, or that's a parking lot, or something like that. And I'll show you the kind of detail here. So again, don't worry too much about this. This is, again, using the surface energy budget and identifying the function and structure of that surface and how it responds in relationship to something else in the urban area. And I'll give you an example. This is again in Puerto Rico. This is 5-meter resolution for my aircraft. And all these squares or polygons are different surfaces. So we got the downtown areas of San Juan, got, a soccer field. This is the University of Puerto Rico. This is the lagoon. And if we, the question would be is, okay, do those areas provide a different enough habitat that would impact, say, mosquito life cycle? What differences can those areas have? And that's what you're looking at when you're trying to understand the risk of mosquito diseases. So I flew the area a couple times and I was able to get the differences in temperature. So this tells me a lot about how stable that environment is. So a road over 9 minutes warms up pretty quickly. The forest doesn't, because it's transpiring water and it keeps constant. Water, of course, it absorbs a lot of energy. So there's very different responses, and these produce different habitats that mosquitoes exposed to, because particularly urban mosquitoes, they're not strong flyers. They don't move more than, say, 100 meters away from where they were hatched. And if you do what I call a thermal response number, this tells me a lot about what's happening. So this gives you that overall habitat environment that vector is exposed to. So now what's happening in the future? And I talked about that this is a very, we're entering the golden age of remote sensing. About 3 weeks ago, we were just authorized to start what we call an observation system for climate impacts and Earth system dynamics. I've been working on the surface biology and geology mission part of that. I'll talk a little bit about that now. And I'll go into a little bit here what exactly this means. So for the first time ever, we're having a coordinated effort to study many parts of the Earth system at the same time using remote sensing. So we've got NISAR, which is a microwave. And you can kind of see here, this cuts across things, the atmosphere, surface deformation. It's important in the water cycle. SGB is what I'm involved with. Cuts across all these things: solid earth, water cycle, ecosystems, even land, coastal stuff. So we're getting all these observations of the Earth's surface, and measuring those real important. And the SBG, surface biology and geology, I work on myself and 2 other people are the applications working group. So we're looking at the applications using SBG. So we've been working with the community and developing applications and seeing what the community means. But this SBG is a global observation system, and it's in the visible spectrum. It's measuring every inch of the Earth at 30 meters and the thermal at 60-meter resolution. Tremendous amount of data that's coming in. We also have now space station, and I'll talk real quick about these other instruments. We've got EcoStress, JEDI, and DESIS. And I'll talk about each of those and why they would be important in determining mosquito habitat risk, et cetera, et cetera. So EcoStress is a thermal instrument. It has 5 bands, 70-meter resolution, and day-night imagery. So as I showed in an earlier slide, you can see just by getting surface temperature, you can get a lot of the factors that are important that drive that mosquito life cycle. So that's up there now. And what we'll have in the future will be even better with the SBG. This is what we call hyperspectral. So it takes and divides the spectrum into very small, discrete channels, 255 or whatever. That's 235 in this one. And so you're actually getting laboratory spectra of the Earth's surface. And that allows you to actually measure chemical processes a lot. So that's also, part of SBG. Now, this is not, but this is what we call Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation LiDAR. It's called JEDI. And I like to say we're better than the JEDI because we have 3 lightsabers, not 1, not 2, but 3 that's examining the Earth. And this produces structure. So you can see the height of the forest canopy, and that's important too, and how the surface contours and everything else. So all these type of information is available. Now, of course, this is a snapshot, compact imager. I'm working with some people in Rice University that can fit on a drone. And so you can very detailed measurements of habitat with that. And this is from a study that University of South Florida has been doing with the Gates Foundation, looking at mosquito habitat in Cambodia. So they can go and they can very detailed map these areas and then actually go in and sample. And one of the things they found in Cambodia that it has what they call monsoon, very wet, very dry periods, that during the dry periods, the mosquito population, the larvae essentially at that point, very concentrated to abandoned irrigation ditches. And they can actually, with a drone, determine the number of larvae that's in that area. And of course, it's more effective when you're controlling mosquitoes to go in the larvicide than to try to spray the mosquitoes. So this is another real advance in using remote sensing. And then, and finally, the overall weather patterns, what they call synoptic weather patterns, is also important in determining, the risk. Because it drives weather pattern. It drives how much rain you're getting, and sometimes you're okay for 5 months of the year, but as soon as that rainy season starts and those breeding areas fill up and mosquitoes start breeding, that's when you start having a problem. So you got to understand the weather patterns too, and that's virtually real time. And so I grabbed this stuff this morning to show you what we get. So this is from a geosynchronous satellite. This is thermal data. We get this data down every 3 minutes, and we can get it what we call the full disk, or continental US, or we can go into an area. So, we're actually doing real-time mapping, imaging of storms. So this is very important if you're trying to say, okay, we've got an area and it hasn't rained for 2 months. Are we going to get the rain? Is it going to start that countdown clock to fill up the habitats required by mosquitoes for them to start breeding? And so, do we need to start doing our control measures? So to sum it up, it's, deceivingly simple what goes into this, but it's very, very complex. What drives this epidemiological equation? Temperature, soil moisture, precipitation, vapor pressure deficit, this thermal response numbers out of that environment, evapotranspiration, solar radiation, and of course, just the land use, land cover on that. So, I kind of gave a broad brush today, and also gave you some very detailed examples. I sent some additional material by email, so you can go in and look at the web pages for these instruments. One of the programs I encourage is another NASA program called Develop. And that's probably one of the few, if only, non-acronym in NASA that I know of. So that's where we have teams of students come in for 10-week sessions. I have 3 teams a year that use remote sensing to address some kind of problem. We've done everything from coastal erosion to looking at tortoise gopher turtles in South Alabama. So there's just all kinds of things, and look at it, and it's another very competitive program, but it's a very good program if you're interested in working with NASA data in whatever area you choose to work in. So
I appreciate the plug for the Develop program. I actually work with the Develop program for mosquitoes three or 4 years ago with Ann Bowser. But isn't it true, Dr. Luvall, that right now for develop, you need to be a graduating senior in
Yes.
university? So this is something to put
Well,
under your hat for 4 years from now. But it's a wonderful program, and it's also a paid internship as well, right? So
right. Well, and I think no, they have to be out. I think they can be. They change it. I think you can be a freshman or sophomore in college. You don't have to you can't be high school. We used to have high school, but that's changed probably 10 years ago or so.
mhm.
But I think once you're at the university, you're eligible. I'd have to check. They change it. I don't worry
And
about that too
it
much.
might
So I
change
don't.
also from site to site and project to project too. But that's great. Hey,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question. I missed the name of the sensor that was put on the drones.
Oh, that was not okay. Okay, let me get that. Yeah, we call it snap
Snap, as opposed to
and
SMAP.
snap.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we did. Yeah. So this is still in development. It's also connected to a space-based instrument too.
Mhm. I think
I can
that's,
send you an article on that. So yeah,
actually, I'd be
but
really
yeah,
interested if you do that. And Dr. Luvall has also given us several articles that I've put in next week's reading, so that now you have a nice background about remote sensing, and I think will make these articles a lot more intelligible. But they're really, really good articles, and I think they're going to find them be pretty exciting to read. Okay, so are you ready for a few questions, sir?
sure, sure.
Okay, so a couple people have put things in the chat. Please go ahead and raise your hands so that we're able to actually
Oh,
see you, since you're all on several different screens. And one of the questions that I wanted to, we'll start out with, because in the chat, is Ashika asked, what is something about remote sensing that's rather unknown to the public, but you think will be important for everyone to know?
oh gosh. Well, the NASA's data policy is it's public domain. So all this data that's collected by these instruments are freely available to everybody. And at one time, up until maybe 5 years ago, the European stuff you couldn't get publicly. And we were able to change that. So the Europeans, I didn't even talk about their satellite development. They've got the Sentinel, and they're developing similar satellites to SVG, and we're all coordinating that. That also has an open data policy. So, I think maybe the public may not realize that it's public domain, and it's open and available. And also there are many tools that are in the public domain, software and stuff like multispec's great for just a basic looking at stuff. It's great to use for that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Juliana, you have a question for Dr. Luvall?
Hi, yes. First, thank you for the great presentation. My question is about the epidemiological model. So is this understanding right, that essentially the energy balance is computed using satellite imagery, and then the variables from that are interpolated into an SIR model or a model with more stages to understand how disease vectors will transition in a certain community?
Mm-hmm. Right, that's correct. That's our goal now. Some places are further along than others, but you have to first understand that particular vector's requirements for habitat and so on before you can use the other information too. And that's people used for a long time precipitation and air temperature, but to bring in remote sensing other than just land use, land cover, that has not been done very much because basically they haven't had the thermal data to do it, and that's key. Thermal remote sensing to that.
Great,
Excellent,
thank you.
thank you.
Mhm.
Yuvraj, you have a question for Dr. Luvall?
Yeah, and thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, how did you get interested in remote sensing, and like, where did you learn most of your knowledge?
That's a good question. Well, my first exposure to remote sensing was photogrammetry, and my undergraduate degree is in forestry, and aerial photography was a tool been used for years and years and years in forestry. But when I started NASA in 1985, Landsat was out in meteorological state satellites and in a few aircraft. But an interesting story is that when I was doing my doctorate PhD work, I was working in tropical rainforests, and I was interested in what happened when the areas are deforested and what happened to the evapotranspiration hydrology. And so my study was looking at that in Costa Rica, but that area I showed you in the aerial photograph, I had my study site about 5 miles out in the jungle there. And I had my samples for sampling the soil water and doing all that stuff. And then I'd come back into the lab. I'd stay out there periodically and then come back into the lab to do an analysis. And so I came in one day and they said, "Oh, there's some guy from NASA that wants to talk to you." Now, this is like in 1982. I thought, why on earth would a NASA person want to be talking to me? And I remember back then, NASA was all space and moon and solar, all that stuff. They didn't really have an earth science programming at the very beginning. So I had no clue. And come to find out, he was head of a research group at Stennis Space Center, but it wasn't called that back then, in Mississippi. And he was building a group to work with remote sensing. And so at that point in time, the engineers could build these sensors and get data, but they had no clue what the data meant. No clue at all. So they were looking for somebody who was trained in ecology, microclimatology, plant physiology, to understand what was happening or what the information was being, what it meant. And I had meteorological instruments above the canopy and stuff like that, which basically is remote sensing in a lot of ways. And so he said, when you're done, apply. And I did. So I've been working for NASA since 1985 and mostly thermal remote sensing, but understanding, ecosystems and what their surface temperature is telling us, how measuring water loss from canopies and this sort of thing. I was also doing precision agriculture and looking at how remote sensing can help there too. So yeah, it was interesting. I never thought I'd ever, in my field, be working for NASA. I'm not an engineer.
Great. Are there any other questions? And while we wait for maybe one more question, I'll ask a question, Dr. Luvall. One of the things that what we're doing is we're trying to provide, using our data, provide an opportunity to look at some of this remote sensing data in a context which is, sort of small enough and understandable if the people can really begin to sort of dig into the science behind it. And of all the thermal instruments that you have mentioned today, is there one that you feel that the data is, I want to say, most easily accessible for our group to look at?
Yeah, EcoStress definitely.
EcoStress, okay.
And Landsat has Landsat thermal data, excuse me, has improved quite a bit. I'll give you a link to a website called Appears, and it's APPEARS.
Yeah, I want to say Appears is really is a game changer for us, isn't it? It makes it a lot easier to get that data.
Right. So I typically don't use it because I get the huge data file and I go ahead and do the processing myself because
Mhm,
I just need that control for that stuff. But
mhm.
yeah, they've improved it quite a bit, and they've got tools the geotiffs come from. The peers are very usable in your applications. Yeah.
Excellent, good. Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question before Dr. Luvall goes? We're just a little bit over time here, but this has been such a great, you gave us a great primer and a primer about remote sensing focused on mosquitoes. I mean, how perfect is that for our audience? And to have it from a leader in the field like this has been, I think, pretty exciting for everyone. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you very much, Dr.
Sure.
Luvall, for meeting with our group of students today. And there has been a lot of really great questions in the chat, and I've been trying to answer some of the basic ones, but I really want to thank you so much for the links that you've provided and the papers you've provided, and most importantly, for this really great talk today.
Okay, well, my pleasure. And I always enjoy doing these talks because the young minds are very, very open, and they're very, very really intelligent. Their drive, their curiosity needs to be encouraged, because there's so many problems that can be addressed by this, and they can become leaders in their areas. So the opportunities are just staggering for the kids now entering this area.
Awesome. Well, that's a great word to end this on. So thank you everyone for coming to the talk today. Thank you, Dr. Luvall. And I just want to remind everyone that there is an evaluation instrument that's up. Please answer those questions, because on the basis of our evaluations is how we are able to obtain the funds to run this program. So we'd like everybody to finish that up by Friday. And we'll see you guys all. Some of you will see this afternoon for the meetup and do science, and otherwise we'll see you next week. So thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Luvall.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, bye.
Bye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.